Live into our commitments of being an anti-racist and fully inclusive church. We received an initial report of this work at our Together in Mission event in January, and there was a Zoom session on Tuesday evening to kind of recap those learnings that was recorded and put on the Synod Assembly webpage. We're now going to take some time at this assembly, an hour here this afternoon and then 2 hours tomorrow morning, to hear an updated report and to engage in conversation about how we can move this work forward. So I'm delighted at this time to welcome Dr. Shauna Payne-Gold and Dr. Lisa Ingerfield of Gold Enterprises, LLC, to the stage to present the first part of their report as shared for our guests.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see your faces. I just want to share I was very pleased and thankful that all of you prayed so hard for 75-degree weather when we got off the plane yesterday, considering that the last time we were here we needed our snow boots. So grateful for the great weather and, of course, grateful to travel safely and see all of you. We're really pleased that we've gotten to this point after a number of months working with you all through this project. And I think what's really important about this is that we do this type of work with lots of different organizations, but it becomes very different and, of course, very personal when you're talking about faith and faith traditions, right? And so we can do this work with NASA, quite literally. We can do this work with other organizations, but that doesn't mean that it hits the same way as it does when we work with organizations like yours. And so given that, this afternoon, we're going to be sharing a little bit about the framing of this audit. And it's really tough to condense all that has been accomplished over the last few months in this time period and tomorrow's time period, but we're going to do our level best when it comes to framing how we approach this work, what was our thought process as we framed the work, and also, too, what are some of the things that we always have to unlearn in regards to the process of collecting information, sharing what's important about that information, and next steps. And so I'm really glad to be here with my co-conspirator here, Dr. Lisa Ingerfield, who will be sharing some more as well in partnership with myself. Once again, my name is Dr. Shauna Payne-Gold. I go by she, her, hers pronouns. I'm originally from Southern Virginia and then relocated to Bowie, Maryland, and I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity to work with you all, okay? And so given that, we'll get right into our slides for this afternoon, but one of the things I just wanted to highlight really quickly as we get started is that it's really important for us to think about what we have learned over time, both as individuals and as community, especially the beloved community, hopefully. Also, what we need to unlearn as individuals and also in community, and then what we will relearn as individuals and in community. Okay? And so given that that's really a big part of what we're going to be sharing in regards to this audit, some things that we will learn, have learned, things that we will need to unlearn, and then how we're going to apply new learning to this work, especially when it comes to inclusivity and especially when it comes to eradicating the very stubborn ideas of racism, okay? And so given that, I just want to share with you what this audit is truly all about. We started this work in May of 2022, and I will say that with this work, we talked very authentically with the Synod Council, with leadership, with many of you under the sound of my voice right now, in regards to how our actions may not have always matched our rhetoric in regards to anti-racism. What can we do to make sure that we continue to be aligned with our faith and our understanding of the work of Christ and the work of the church? And so given that, this audit really does help us to think through from a really deep level to think about how we look at our governing documents, our public statements, how we interact with one another. Sometimes it's very telling what we don't say as a church community as well as what we do say. And so are we truly examining those things? And so what we did was we looked at your documents. We looked at your protocols, policies, procedures. I'm often asked when we do these types of audits, why do you need to look at policy and talk about procedure? Because they should be one and the same. And in fact, that's where we find a lot of our work is when policy doesn't match procedure, right? It's a suggestion, but there can be inequities that rise up with that, right? So we looked at those governing documents. We also had a large-scale survey that was created by the wonderful brain of Dr. Ingerfield back here that we worked in collaboration with. She is phenomenal when it comes to that work. My brain understands it, but that's not my ministry, y'all. Okay, so I make sure that Dr. Ingerfield comes in with the heavy-duty work of the survey. And I think what's really important is that we're always looking to figure out what we don't know. And we don't know what we don't know all the time. And so therefore, these types of all-encompassing 360 audits really help us to discover those things that we don't know quite yet. Now, why in the world is this important? Because usually when I first hear audit, I have to be honest with you, the first thing I think about is the IRS, and that's not always a good thought, right? And that's not at all the approach that we took with this work. This was not an attempt to be an I gotcha moment, I caught you moment in things that we weren't doing well, but more so how can we call ourselves into community to think about what we're not doing, what wasn't even on our radar, and what we should put on our agenda moving forward. And so given that, I think what's really important about an audit is that it helps us to identify those things that prevent us from being exactly who we say we want to be as an anti-racist organization, okay? It helps us to really see where we can make those changes, and also it helps us to be disruptive. We were just talking about that during the luncheon earlier, about how can we be disruptive, right? How do we ask those disruptive questions that make us stop and think about the way we've always done things, right? And so given that we spend that time through this audit process, and it can also help us to interrupt ourselves and the history that isn't always kind. It isn't always kind, it isn't always inclusive, and it doesn't always call in, okay? So that's why it's important, right? This is one of the quotes that I really felt was important. My team actually read Lenny Duncan's book specifically on Dear Church prior to starting this work. We do have our various faith traditions. I was actually trained and ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which has its own historical exclusionary practices from the United Methodist Church. And so as I read this book to get to know your denomination even further and talking with lots of folks that are within the ELCA, what I thought was really important was this quote here, which says, Jesus was an orator who used his words to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. He chose his words wisely, knowing that one message was needed in a large crowd, another message for a close friend, and still another for the powers and the principalities of his day. But he always said what needed to be said, okay? And so this kind of lends itself to the notion that usually we're not a prophet in our own land. There's been many times where I was called in to do work and asked to do this type of work, and many voices had already expressed the very same thing that I came in as a third party to acknowledge, right? And so given that, we are gonna say the tough things, and we are gonna ask the tough questions, and we can do it all, as we were just talking about during the luncheon today. We can ask those hard questions and be disruptive with kindness and love at the very same time. And that's what we plan to do, okay? All right, so framing the ways we know things. Dr. Ingerfield, do you want to take over? There you go.
Well, hi, everyone. I realize that we are between you and dinner, I think, so hang in there with us. So as Dr. Gold said, my name is Dr. Lisa Ingerfield, pronouns she, hers. I'm going to just go over a couple of considerations when you think about framing the results of the equity audit that we will be sharing with you primarily tomorrow. We're also going to talk a little bit about some mindset shifts that we would love for folks to engage in as you think about the material and moving forward and, you know, in the future, engaging and continuing to engage in this work. So the first kind of framing or maybe reframing consideration is, how do we know what we know, right? The ways of knowing and of learning, and how does that impact how we understand information that might be disruptive to our status quo, right? So while the equity audit that we have been engaging in with the Greater Milwaukee Synod is not research per se, right? It's not academic research, it's not being published or anything like that. When we think about research and evaluation and assessment and auditing that has happened over time, those practices have often been fairly exclusive practices, and they have often minimized or excluded groups and voices who are marginalized in our society, right? And so what we have found is that the work that we try to do at Gold Enterprises is a little different. There is certainly a place for numbers and surveys. Obviously, you learned that I love surveys. But also we want to expand that tent. We want to make sure that we are hearing from folks who don't often have a seat at the table. When we make observations about a group, those observations are often ill-informed, they are often full of assumption and stereotype. And so numbers without context can often lead to some of those errors. So at Gold Enterprises, we are trying to push back on that. We're trying to think about how can we engage and expand how we know what we know through different avenues, right? So thinking about personal narrative. I mean, we've talked today about stories and how stories are who we are, and how each of us have stories of inclusion and exclusion, and how important it is for us to understand those stories because they are so central to each of our lives. So personal narrative, oral history, right? Not all history is written down. That is definitely a Western way of thinking about historical record. We also know that a lot of historical record has been doctored, right? Is not actually accurate. And so how do we learn from everyone about their trajectory and their experience in the ELCA or in the Milwaukee Synod specifically? And that isn't always going to be written down, right? So hearing from people is really important. Also spending time with you. So being at the Together in Mission, right? Being here with you. We ran focus groups, we did interviews, we have spent time with leadership, and we have observed, and that's really important to be in community with all of you. So there's this much kind of broader approach. So when you're thinking about the results that we'll share tomorrow, it's important that you understand that, right? That you understand that we are pulling information from all of these different places, and we are working hard to not simply rely on abstract numbers that lack context and often only present information in one way. So let me go to the next slide here. So just to reiterate what Dr. Gold had shared is that the many ways that we have been gathering information through this audit, so documents, policies, we held focus groups that many of you participated in, we had individual interviews with many of you, we did the survey, we have had those observations. So when we talk about data, it's really easy for people to kind of assign data to be numbers, right? And when we think about data and we think about evaluating and understanding equity broadly, racial equity specifically, is we're looking at data in a much broader way, right? To really kind of destabilize those ways of knowing that we have been taught are correct or appropriate or traditional. All right, oh, I think I jumped. Okay, there we go. So the other framing or reframing consideration that we want for you to think about is this generalizability versus usefulness. So if there are any researchers in the room, right, you're going to be very familiar with generalizability. It's the concept that we can take information from a smaller group and extrapolate it out or generalize it out to the larger group, to a population, right? And it usually involves math. And so sometimes what happens is generalizability gets conflated with usefulness. And so we really want you to understand that when we're doing this work, we're looking for useful information. And useful information isn't always generalizable, right? They're not the same thing. And so when we're hearing from people about their life experience and the harm that may have been caused for them, that's their individual experience. Is that individual experience generalizable? Not necessarily. But it's useful, right? It's useful to know. And so sometimes when we start to shift the narrative from numbers and empirical observations and kind of context-free information, questions of rigor start to come up. Well, that doesn't sound credible. Well, that isn't really that rigorous. And we would push back on that and say everyone's individual story and everyone's experience is absolutely credible and is absolutely rigorous, right? Because the information that we're getting from each of you as you share your experiences is extremely useful for us. So we don't need to have 2,000 people tell us that they have experienced a microaggression or discrimination within the context of their faith to know that there might be a problem, right? So if there were 10 people that had that experience, that's enough of a reason for us to say that's not okay, we need to do something about that. So I really want to push you to think about not getting caught up in numbers and statistics and generalizability, and think more about what can you take from the information? What is the learning? What do these stories and these themes and these concepts tell us? How can we de-center historical ways of knowing that have often been only about white, male, cisgender, heterosexual ways of knowing? How can we de-center that and start to engage in different ways of understanding people's reality and people's lived experience? That's going to be a really important part of this. So whether we have 6 people involved in the audit or 72,000 people involved in the audit, right, doesn't ultimately matter from a sense of learning and growth and how we can apply that understanding moving forward to improve everyone's experience and authentically engage in this work. All right, I think it is back to you, Dr. Gold.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And so given that, again, we just want to remind everyone of some of the things that we want you to hold as you're hearing the report out tomorrow. Another piece of that is presence and absence. Presence and absence. Oftentimes when we do an audit, we're usually looking for something, right? I'm working with an organization right now that's a bunch of bank auditors. Obviously they're looking for something, good or bad, they're looking for it, right? And so given that we're looking for the presence of something, but we would suggest that it's very important to also query the absence of voices. Who is not speaking? What does that absence mean or say to us? What does that suggest in regards to who is engaged and who is not engaged, or who may have given up entirely, right? And so given that we have lots of opportunities to really think about where are people and their voices present, where are they absent, and then the bigger part of that is why. Why is that the case, right? And there may be lots of reasons for that, whether it's lack of trust with individuals, lack of trust with the Synod more broadly. Maybe there's the feeling that, wait, I have been past this rock before, I have shared my story multiple times, this feels like a waste of time to me, so now I have decided that I'm going to escort myself out of this conversation, right? Depending on the level of trust. So given that, we have to consider how marginalized voices are heard. Usually I think it's really interesting, especially in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, lots of folks mention the voice. Let's give a particular group voice, right? I would extremely push back on that to say each and every human being has voice. We choose to not listen to it at times, and we need to make the choice to listen to it and often amplify it, right? And so given that, where are those voices being listened to, being heard, being codified, being supported, being empowered? And then also, I love the examples that we've shared earlier about who's present at the table and who is not, right? What chair is available and what isn't? Are we making sure that people are invited, right? Now, what I think is really curious about that table that we're referring to in regards to presence and absence is who in the world even knows that the table exists, right? Who thinks they own the whole table? Who's the loudest at the table, right? And so given that, we have to start querying more of those questions. Who's decided that they're gonna build a different table and they're gonna build it in a different place, in a different space? There's so many different ways that that conversation of presence and absence can go, but we would be remiss if we didn't ask those questions, okay? Now we have a real complex table here, but let me give you the skinny on what this means. mindset shifts that Dr. Ingerfield alluded to before. When it comes to mindset shifts, I would suggest that anyone under the sound of my voice that has been educated here in the United States, particularly has been educated in much of the left-handed side of that table in Western science, right? Where we have been positioned in such a way and educated in such a way that we limit what we know to what we think we can prove over and over again. Almost like a scientific method, of course. Emphasis on understanding the how. That can be a huge barrier, right? So I've been in those situations before, especially as an African-American woman who is also the mother of 2 African-American boys, to try to explain our lived experience. And the rationale for not taking action on it is because I don't quite understand it, right? When it's something that may never be understood. And so given that, how can we continue to have empathy and support of individuals where we will never understand their experience, but we're certainly aware of it, right? The skepticism, that's the way I was trained in all of my degree. Prove it. It's not true until you prove it to me. And you have to prove it to me multiple times until I feel like getting it, right? Until I feel like getting it. Hypothesis. This is something my 6th grader is working on right now. How do you articulate a hypothesis, and how much emphasis do we put on proving it right or wrong? Okay. Quantitative written record and mathematical knowledge, again, to what Dr. Ingerfield suggested before. What can we quantify, and what do those numbers mean exactly? And then the communication of that evidence and theory. How do we communicate that out to the world, right? We would suggest that we need to move over a bit in this big graph to think about open-mindedness. If it's true for a small group, then it is inherently true for them. They are the experts of their lived experience, right? The body of knowledge is stable, but it's also up for modification, right? It's up for modification. As we know better, we then do better, as Maya Angelou would say, right? And so given that, how do we continue to add to the body of knowledge rather than continuously negating that it even exists, right? Being honest and inquisitive, paying attention to patterns. How are we continuing to find some common ground here in ways that we have learned before that we may need to unlearn so that we can relearn what's truly going on in the lived experiences of those who are excluded, okay? All right, so given all this, I want to just pause here by saying that we feel very strongly that there is equity to be found in both the product of what we're providing you in an audit, but also the process with which we do it, okay? And so given that, we are very clear on our methods of our work, we're very intentional on why we do what we do, and I feel very strongly as an organization, even if everyone in the room disagrees with how something was executed, we can, with validity and with authenticity and faith, say that we did this with intentionality to decrease harm and increase healing, right? Because part of this equity audit, from our understanding, was very much about healing, right? Not just identifying the brokenness, okay? And so given that, I think this is a really important quote to highlight here, and of course, Shauna needs a new prescription, so I'm gonna read, I'm gonna read the screen that's largest to me. I got a little bit of a glare on that one, I think I can get it over here. So this last quote that we felt was really profound and spoke to the work that we're doing with you all is this. This desire to learn what the faith is from those who have lived it in the face of being told that they are not welcome or worthy is far more than inclusion. Actually, inclusion isn't the right word at all, because it sounds like in our niceness and virtue, we are allowing, quote, them to join, quote, us. Like we are judging another group of people to be worthy of inclusion in a tent that we don't own, okay? So that goes back to what we were mentioning too about that doggone table. Who owns it? Who's responsible for it? Who's the loudest? Who's the softest? Who's standing at the table because nobody offered them a doggone seat? Those are things that we thought about in this audit. And so with this, we hope that we framed the information in such a way, not necessarily to hedge our bets at all, but to simply say that we went through a really nice journey of interrupting ourselves with, why are we applying this method? This method inherently is exclusive as we're studying inclusion. And so to think about these things in very rational and intentional ways, okay? So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for all of you being part of this journey. I know that all of you have participated in various levels in various ways. I want to thank, of course, Mary for being such wonderful hostess and making sure we got where we needed to be, both in January and also this weekend. Of course, the wonderful Dr. Caldwell that has been such a wonderful contributor to every single conversation that we've been involved in with this work. And I just thank you for all the levels of participation, because of course we could not do this without you all as the Synod. Okay. So with that, I'll yield the floor back. Thank you so much.
Thank you. At this time, we would like to just take a few moments for some table conversations so that you can turn to the folks around and kind of process what you have heard, what questions it raises for you as you think about moving into tomorrow to hear additional information. One note that I would like to share is that the presentation slides for this afternoon's and tomorrow's presentation are already posted on the Synod Assembly web page. If you go there, you will see on, I've got it up on my phone here, it's a blue box that says Quick Reference Resources. So if you scroll down there, you will then see the Authentic Diversity Audit presentation slides in 3 different groups. Plenary 1, which is the slides we just saw, Plenary 2, Part 1, and then Part 2. So the slides are already there if you want to take them out, download them, look them over, use them however you wish. Before we break into some table conversations, I'd like to just offer a word of framing, if I might, because sometimes when folks think about this work, they say, what's all that got to do with Jesus? Right? What does this have to do with the gospel? Why are we doing this politically correct thing? Right? Well, this is about the gospel of Jesus Christ, because as I understand the gospel of Jesus Christ, it is to provide us with lives that have meaning, purpose, and belonging, couched in love. Right? That's what our lives are about. It's to have meaning, purpose, and belonging. And whatever gets in the way of us experiencing meaning, purpose, and in this case specifically belonging, I think we call that sin, right? We need to confess that sin, and then we need to figure out what are we going to do with that sin, right? So this is all about what keeps us as the people of God, as the Church of Jesus Christ, from experiencing the fullness of what God has to offer us through the power and love of Jesus Christ made real in the context of Christian communities. So that's why this, to me, is about how we live out the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? So I invite you to have some conversations now around your tables. What did you hear that struck your ear? What questions do you have? What's stirring in your soul? We'll give you about 12 minutes for some table conversations, and then we'll come back to close out this first plenary.